All right, so Logan Paul actually responded to George Janko, and honestly, his response was better than I expected, mostly because it's Logan Paul and he's not really known to respond to controversy very well. So I figured if he was going to address this, he'd get way too worked up about it and emotional and trash George and yell at Mike for doing George's podcast and just make things much worse for himself. But it seems like maybe he's learned a little. This was at least more level-headed than some of his previous responses. And he actually won some people over with this and had some people siding with him, which is pretty crazy. It's not easy to get people to take Logan Paul's side. But I will say, Logan, he didn't really address the most significant thing that George brought up, the whole Bobby Lee situation. Logan didn't really have much to say about that. I mean, he did say he just should have handled it better, and he apologized for it, which who knows if it's genuine. But the fact that he didn't have much to say about it and apologized shows that George actually has a valid complaint there. And it seems like Bobby was just off the rails during that podcast and was basically sexually assaulting George, which if you remember, George also said they cut some of those parts out of the podcast because they knew it'd be a bad look for Bobby. So I feel like Logan could have done a much better job responding to this, and this was like the most significant thing I thought that George brought up. But he probably didn't want to get too much into it because it is more of a serious thing. He's basically trying to cover up his co-host getting sexually assaulted.
But this isn't to say, by the way, that I didn't fuck up along the way. I did. I should not have mocked his beliefs. I apologize for that. I should have stuck up for him with Bobby Lee, and I definitely should have had his back more like a friend. There's a lot of things I would have done differently, but here we are. It saddens me that our story has unfolded this way. I wish him nothing but health, wealth, happiness, all the success that he wants, and I hope that one day we can sit down and have a relationship and a conversation.
Yeah, so that's all he had to say about the Bobby Lee situation, which basically proves George wasn't lying about it. I mean, there's definitely something there, because if he was just making it up, obviously Logan would have addressed it. Like, he addressed the whole money situation here, and he came with receipts and everything, but with the Bobby Lee thing, he only mentions it for like a couple seconds, because he probably realizes that it's a terrible look for him and Bobby. There's really no excuse or defense for it. So that's probably why he didn't want to get into it too much. But for the whole money situation, he had no problem getting into that because he came with some receipts that showed George was actually making good money on the podcast and he's getting reimbursed for all the travel expenses. Because George claimed he was spending $10,000 a month to do the podcast, which I thought was kind of weird. Like, I don't know why it'd cost that much money to do it.
The show, and I'm getting pushed out.
You made money on the show.
I can show you my books. I was spending 10 G's a month being on the show.
All right, let's talk about this. Obviously, I wasn't on the podcast to represent myself, so I'd like to clarify a few things that were said. As well as having his own credit card, all expenses related to the show were paid for, including all travel and lodging. Obviously, George's total reimbursement came out to $20,000, 317 cents. I'd love to see any books that show otherwise. Spending $120,000 a year to be on a show is a little confusing.
This is a guy who's sending us screenshots of $11 million a week that he's making.
The statement is so crazy that it's almost laughable. That would mean I'm making $572 million a year. I'm nowhere near that. What happened was Prime had a very successful month. I think we did like 60 to 70 million, and I sent it to our group chat because I was proud of the business. I was stoked to show the boys, and I think George maybe misinterpreted that as like my personal income.
And that part at the end there, I think most people understood that George wasn't talking about Logan personally. At least I figured that he was referring to Prime when he said that. So I don't know why Logan would address that and act like it's so ridiculous and then basically prove that he did send him that screenshot. So then also, like I said, Logan talked about how much money George was making on the podcast. And this is where I kind of side with Logan here, unfortunately, because George was making a good amount of money. This is not something I'd be complaining about. I mean, most people would kill to be making this kind of money and only working a couple of hours a week. The worst part about it is he has to work with Logan Paul, which I understand. But if you're making this kind of money, I don't know if there's much to complain about. And George did say he was really grateful for the opportunity, but then he's like, I was only making $5,000 a month, which I think 1 month he only made $5,000. And I mean, $5,000 is still a good amount of money for doing a podcast. And then all the other months on average, he's probably making around 15 to 20,000. And of course, when Mike brings that up, he's like, oh, you made a good amount of money. I think you made around, and then they bleep it out. And George is like, I don't like to talk money, even though he just mentioned how much money he made. So of course, he's not afraid to say the least amount of money he's making. But then when Mike brings up that he made a good amount of money every other month, he doesn't want to talk about it. And like Logan mentions here, the podcast only takes around 3 hours a week, so he's making a really good rate. and it gives him plenty of time to be working on other things if he needs the money.
The show hit rock bottom, and we weren't getting paid. I was getting paid $5,000 a month.
But you did make a sizable amount of money on the show.
And by the
What
way,
would you say,
always
like,
grateful. I was always grateful.
like that?
for it. Yeah, I don't like to talk about money.
I know he doesn't want to talk money. I know he believes it out, but George made $317,000 in the 15 months that he got paid for on Impulsive. The work requirements consisted of about 3 days a month, 3 hours each day, traveling the world, networking, and meeting some of the coolest people ever. It comes out to about $2,300 per hour, and he also had 10% equity of the entire show.
Not you, not Caleb, not Kevin, not Dylan. Nobody called me when I got fired.
George did not get fired. He quit. I'll touch on that in a second. But after he quit, I called him frequently. I reached out. I wanted to reconcile the friendship. I invited him to my birthday party and WrestleMania and even my ranch a few weeks later. He chose not to come. He also unfollowed all the people he mentioned on Instagram, which is maybe why they didn't call him. I don't know. I can't speak for them, but he still does not follow them to this day.
And then on my birthday, you guys shot 3 episodes, so I couldn't show up.
The 2 episodes he's talking about, not 3, were shot 4 days after George's birthday. His birthday's on January 3rd. We shot those episodes on January 7th. We were already in Vegas signing the UFC to Prime, and as we do, want to capitalize on the location and our use of time and energy and the guests in that city. George didn't come to work because he wanted to spend time with his family for his belated birthday, which I totally understand and we even praised.
One of the things that I love about George, he prioritizes his family and friends over anything.
And then also Logan addresses the whole Celsius sponsorship situation where George took a sponsorship with them on his podcast while he's still doing Impulsive, and Logan was mad because they're a competitor to Prime. Which, like I said in my last video, I think Logan's kind of hypocritical here because when the situation was reversed and his brother was doing a boxing event that was sponsored by Celsius, Logan wanted to promote Prime there, but they obviously told him no because it's a competitor. And I don't know why they would want to give him free advertising, but Logan, he thought that was out of line and he had a little temper tantrum and got all pissed off at Jake for it. But here's what he had to say about George taking the Celsius deal.
I got my show going, and then not only was I controlled and pushed around on Impulsive, but then Logan's making calls and directing my show. He told me that I couldn't take Celsius.
So this is the big one. Making calls, trying to make it seem like I wanted to control his show is absolutely ridiculous. As you can see right here, I was like, hey, we got to get you Prime because I saw him drinking our competitor, and he told me to call him. He was filming my reaction to tell me he took a deal with a competitor. I told him, please don't film. Like, I'd like to talk about this. I hope you're joking, by the way. The truth is, I thought it was a bad look that my best friend and co-host took a brand deal with our competitor without consulting me, asking me, giving us even a chance to match it before he signed the deal, because the audience that he's building, at least at the time, on his own podcast was being funneled directly from the podcast that I was building with him. I said, hey dude, I understand you need to make money. The entire text is right here that I sent him after our conversation, because I did understand his position if he needed to make money, but I thought it was also a little odd because he did make $317,000 in 15 months. Regardless, I did tell him I can't have him on Impulsive if he's going to take the deal with the competitor, but if after he makes the money he wants to come back to the podcast, he's more than welcome.
Yeah, so I kind of understand Logan's side here. You know, before George took the Celsius deal, he probably should have seen if Prime would match the offer, which I don't know if they would have, but at least you could have said you tried and you gave him the opportunity. And then also Logan mentioned that George was recording the call when he was telling him he took the Celsius deal, which, if that's true, is a little shady. But also, if you remember, George recently said during all this, like when he was telling Logan about the deal, Logan told him if he really needs the money, then he should just go get it from his rich parents, which Logan didn't mention that at all during this response. Like, he had nothing to say about it. So it seems like he probably did say that, which is pretty messed up. But it sounds like at that point in the relationship, they're just over each other. You know, they're probably arguing the whole time.
Hey man, where you're at, there's no room for you to grow. They won't let you grow. They will not let you grow.
I thought saying that to Mike was a little crazy. He's grown a lot. He has 2.7 million subscribers since we met. He's a multimillionaire, a best-selling author. I tried as much as I could to help him get into those positions, and it's not entirely because of me. Mike is a phenom in his own right, and he capitalized on the platform that I gave him, which is awesome. Just like George is doing now, but if that's not growth, like what is? In fact, I think people forget, like, I praised George for starting a podcast like a lot.
Georgie started his own podcast. I think it's a great idea. I always love when my co-hosts venture out and do their own things. Congratulations. It's awesome, guys. Check out his podcast.
And also saying they won't let you grow was a little hurtful because I thought at least I helped Mike do some of the things that he did, and I even encouraged him to start his own podcast.
I think you should take a page out of Georgie's book and start a show of your own.
There's no greater feeling than watching people you love succeed. I tried to give people around me a platform, and if they capitalize on it, fantastic. Mike and George did. And George will even tell you this off camera. I encouraged him to pursue media and comedy since 2015. I really believe in the kid, and I still do.
Yeah, so for Logan Paul, I'd say that response was pretty good. You know, I figured he'd probably trash George a little bit, but there wasn't much of that. You know, maybe some of it was kind of passive aggressive, but I also think George sounded maybe a little entitled when he was talking about at least the money situation and the opportunity that he had doing that podcast, because that's really the only reason anybody knows him, and he has a successful podcast right now. But also with the whole Bobby Lee situation, he definitely has a valid complaint there. Logan had nothing to say about that in terms of refuting it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that, because also I think this is making a lot of people realize how creepy Bobby Lee is. He's done a lot of creepy shit in the past, which I've talked a little bit about on Patreon, but I might make a whole YouTube video about it because there's a lot more to cover. If you want to see that, let me know down in the comments. And then if you want more content from me, make sure you check out my Patreon account. I'm going to be posting a new video on there today about the time Tim Dillon humbled Whitney Cummings during this really cringy podcast. And there are over 70 other videos on there at this point. So if you're a fan of the channel and you want to help support it, make sure you check it out. I'll put a link in the description.